My name is Tanner Yackley, also known as Blackjack. I served nearly 10 years in the U.S. Air Force as an MQ-9 Reaper sensor operator. I logged over 3,000 combat hours. This is everything I'm authorized to tell you. Being physically separated, 7,500 miles away from the target, you're having to take a life or watch things happen that you have no control over whatsoever. And then you have to go home and deal with dinner and deal with kids' birthdays and deal with anniversaries, and you just watched absolutely horrendous things happen on a screen, and there's no way to escape it. When we're surveilling the targets, usually there's many different things we could be looking for. Sometimes it was just, hey, does this person have a weapon? Is this person trying to plant an IED on the side of the road? Or is this person, trying to pass a note? Or is it a certain individual that we're looking for? It was dependent on what type of target we were on for the day. But most of the time, there was some type of trigger event. Either it could be someone, all right, if they're actively digging, and we confirm that they have a weapon and an IED, then that's enough, to check a box and say, yes, now we can take out that target. Or if all of a sudden they start actively shooting on friendly forces, that was usually enough to go, yes, we can employ on this target. Sometimes it could be that short of just someone says, hey, there's a person shooting a mortar at a base, and we get eyes on, and within 30 seconds, we're pulling the trigger. Because you can see mortar tubes light up like a 4th of July show in infrared. So it's really easy to find an active mortar tube. We don't have any other information. It's just that this is a bad guy. Everything's correlated here. There's other times that we would watch people for days, weeks, months. We had one target at our unit that I think we watched for 6 years before we finally had the opportunity to take them out. Usually when we're tracking patterns of life, it would be things like you'd watch somebody wake up for the day, go feed their goats, go play with their kids, hug their wife, drive their family somewhere, whatever. But then all of a sudden it turns and they're starting to follow somebody or walk or meet with somebody. Sometimes it was just following somebody through a market building all day, which made it very difficult just because you're in very high density areas with a ton of people, a ton of vehicles. So you're really trying to pull out details specifically of that target and make sure that you don't lose them. You had a electro-optical being the day TV camera that you could see colors, and that was obviously very good for targeting and tracking because you can pull a lot of detail from, a colored image than you can a black and white image. I always tell people that, I could tell you what color a license plate is. I can't tell you exactly what the license plate says. And then the infrared was black and white. You can gain your own information from pulling out heat signatures and things like that. Sometimes one wheel would run hotter than the other 4 on a vehicle. And so then we knew, all right, that's our vehicle because that back right wheel is hot. So a drone strike is carried out in multiple ways. It's like a surgeon. You're preparing and operating in a certain way, and you're following a checklist throughout the entire thing, all as methodical as possible. The chain of command is going to be, based off your intelligence, whether that's what you're collecting, whether you're collecting like signals intelligence, things like that with it. So there's many people that are within the chain that pair everything together and say, yes, because we watched this video of them from 3 years ago and correlated it with what you're seeing right now, along with 10 other things, then we're 99% confident this is the same person. And or it could be as simple as this is an active threat, we need to take them out now. And then usually, we would pass on the information to, our pilot that was the lead for the day. Then they would run through their own chain of command with it and then essentially come back with authorization saying, yes, we authorize you to conduct that strike. Sometimes that could take hours, sometimes that could take seconds. Usually the decisions that were being made were done, outside of our room. But that's the beauty of what we did is you could send the real-time feed anywhere in the world to put this information right in front of people and allow them to make real-time calls. With the aircraft, you've got, everything, every munition on it for the most part is laser guided. The laser comes from the camera, shines down, and there's a little reticle on the screen, a little crosshairs that wherever I move, the laser's in the middle of. If I drag it to the right, well, then my missile is going to start guiding to the right. Because of that, I had to be extremely precise in that time, and most time of flights of a missile is between 30 and 40 seconds. That was usually the correlation between the two with the laser and the crosshairs, was wherever that got moved, that's where the missile went. The difference between a drone pilot and a drone sensor operator is the pilot you think of as the person that is controlling the plane, flying it to where it needs to be in a point in space. They are utilizing what we call stick and rudder. And the sensor operator is the one that controls the camera on the aircraft, actively following targets, manipulating it to pull out details, contrast, brightness, gain, level, things like that. And then the pilot is the one that actively pulls the trigger and employs a weapon, while the sensor operator is the one that is actually lasing in that weapon. Everything is a two-part process. During any strike, my responsibility as a sensor operator was to essentially back the pilot up on the entire strike flow. So making sure that, if they were going to pull a trigger at a certain range from the target, that they were at that range and they were holding in the correct place to do that. Once we were nose to the target and driving in, the pilot would pull the trigger, the weapon would come off the rail, it would cause the screen to go fuzzy. It's good to do with the missile plume. And then once that cleared, if it was a moving vehicle or something like that, I would try to get a track on it. It was, again, this trying to manipulate the picture, manipulate the camera, make sure the pilot's doing what they're supposed to be doing, and also making sure that I don't forget to turn a laser on, otherwise the missile's not going to hit the target. And then for the next 30 seconds, it's all on me to make sure that wherever I move my crosshairs, that missile's going. So I've got to be insanely steady with how I, move those crosshairs, so that way I don't miss my target. The reason that the pilot and the sensor operator is a two-person crew, right, is one, just because at least right now, the technology, while they've tried, it just doesn't work. It's way too technical, especially on the sensor operator side, and needing to be able to make real-time decisions and changes and things like that. I mean, they attempted to even put technology in it 20 years ago to say, hey, snap to these targets and look here. But because of, magnetic fields and rotational drift and things like that, with the Earth itself, it doesn't work that way. You can't get something to fixate that precisely onto a target when you have so many moving parts to it. So the technology just really isn't there yet. You can't train a computer to do, or you can't train one person to do both jobs. So the MQ-9 Reaper, one of the most common ones out there that's flown today. This aircraft has a 66-foot wingspan, so it's pretty big. It's not the little quadcopters that people see buzzing around and everything else out there. This is a full-size aircraft, and it's controlled either line of sight, so needing a direct connection to the aircraft, or via satellite communication by bouncing signals into the sky off satellites around the curvature of the Earth, and then getting into wherever it's operating. The MQ-9 usually sounded like any really other turboprop aircraft. We always joked about the MQ-1, the smaller one, sounding like a lawnmower because of the snowmobile engine it had on it. But the MQ-9 was, was a 900 shaft horsepower engine on it, so it's pretty big size. And so you still had to worry about the sound signature, but it just sounded like, any other aircraft flying above your head. And because we operated at 20 to 30,000 feet, typical airliner altitude, unless you were in the right spot, being downwind from it, you could pick it up. But most of the time, we were so good with our audio signature, unless you were really low on the ground, you never really heard it. I had one strike that I was with a newer pilot that I don't think they had struck before. So this was their first time. I was fairly seasoned at the time. We got set up on the target. We knew exactly what we were going to do. It was a vehicle next to a building out in the open. The guy was just sitting outside his car, about as straightforward as it can come for a target. And it was like, okay, let's go ahead and turn in. And right when we got our clear to engage call, which was always the call that we were waiting for at that point, once it came across the radio, the expectation was the trigger was pulled. My laser's already on, and then I'm at that point guiding. I waited for that individual to pull the trigger when we got the clearance call, and they didn't. And then instead I heard, okay, is everybody ready? And I went, what the heck? I looked over and I'm like, pull the flippin' trigger right now. Because that was their responsibility. That was what they were supposed to do in that moment. Because any second we delayed, we let any external factor potentially come into play, right? Whether that's a person showing up or the person just getting into the vehicle and leaving, we didn't know what was going to happen. Right? So anytime that it was, a nice clear-cut situation like that, you wanted to move as fast as possible to capitalize on it. Bus full of nuns is what we always call the proverbial bus full of nuns, saying that any given time when you're employing a weapon, a bus that is figuratively full of nuns on it could be driving into that, target area, things like that. So it's essentially comes down to you just always have to plan for the unplanned. So needing to focus on what could happen, and while you hope nothing does, you always have to be prepared for it. We had one time where we had to abort in a strike as all of a sudden the vehicle started moving and they started driving towards a gas station. And we didn't want to obviously have our weapons impact next to a gas station. So we aborted it. And usually with that is the rule is you're going 90 degrees off from wherever your target is, and you're utilizing maps that you have up to be able to quickly make decisions within split seconds of exactly where I'm going to shift that weapon. Hope to God nobody's standing there, and hope that it's in wide open field. Because like I said, we try to control as much as we can, but at the end of the day, there's only so much you can. So with that one, we shifted the missile off to a field, and it impacted in the field, 200 meters away, and everything was a-okay. I'm sure the person on the ground was like, what in the heck? But past that, it all went by the book. A lot of the parameters in aborting a strike is set around how important the person is, right? If it's somebody that's super high value, an immediate threat, it's going to take a lot more to abort that strike than there would be if it's just somebody, super low level. There's so many decision makers when an abort gets called. Sometimes that can be on the crew. Sometimes that can come from way high up in the chain of command as well, that they hold the authority on the abort. One of the most important things when you're striking a target is minimizing the sonic boom of the missile. Because depending on how far off of the nose of the aircraft you get, the farther I get away from that, the longer the sonic boom is, which just gives somebody the ability to hear, the missile. So the aircraft is driven to a certain point in space at that time, and then a trigger is pulled to make sure that this comes in at the exact angle it needs to, because I can't have a weapon that comes into the roof of a building and punches out the side of the room because I didn't do my angles correctly. So we had a lot of programs and things like that would do the math for us, but it was a lot of interpolation of the data and making sure that what we were planning for, we actually executed. My ground control station was the base outside Las Vegas, Creech Air Force Base. We operated there while our plane was 7,500 miles around the world, in Afghanistan. This is about a 30 by 10 foot kind of shipping container looking box, if you will. It had nice padded, carpeted walls and a ton of, servers and electronics. So usually they're pretty cool temperature-wise, just because you've got a ton of, electronics running throughout the room there that you have to keep cold. And then usually you had dim lighting throughout because any type of bright lights would cause glare on the screen. And then you had usually 2 different keyboards, 2 different mice, 8 different screens that you were looking at any given time. We did shift work. So, you were on 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., 4 p.m. to midnight, midnight to 8 a.m. Rotation. Day in the life was usually wake up, 6 a.m., throw the flight suit on. I'd get in, sit down in what we call a mass brief, essentially briefing the entire team that was flying that night. You flew with the same people for the most part every night. You'd get the briefing, you'd get the things like the intelligence of what's going on, right? Is there specific target factors that we need to worry about? And that could be, just basic target data on the person, how many kids they have, who their wife is, what color vehicle they drive, what compound they stay at. And then the weather, needing to know things like what the winds are doing, things that are going to affect us overall for the mission itself. And then you'd get farmed out on who you were flying with for the night. And that could be anything, which turned into some some grueling nights and some long shifts and things like that, because you were having to sit for 6, 7, 8, sometimes 10 hours, and some people did 12 pretty regularly. The shift work in itself was just grueling, just because of how quick we had to rotate. You know, you're trying to fight your circadian rhythm at that point, which just wasn't happening. So then you get less and less sleep and things like that were obviously impactful in doing such a high operation tempo mission and trying to run on like 2 to 3 hours of sleep. I was stationed at Creech for 4 years. Never fell asleep in the seat or fell asleep during a mission, but there was plenty of people that did, you know, just because of the crazy operation tempo that we operated at. We just white knuckled through it all. It was just whatever, grab another energy drink, grab another cup of coffee, or some popcorn with jalapenos in it, and hope that it does the trick. Flipping the switch is used to talk about, you know, going from work to home and home to work. I live by myself for the most of the time. So, you know, there's plenty of times where it was simple things like, you know, I left the trash can out and some HOA's mad at me or something for it. But I got to bring that into work with me. You know, I got to try to flip that switch off and say, okay, I got to deal with that at, you know, 10 hours from now, because for the next 10 hours, I need to worry about my job. I enlisted when I was 18 years old. I was fresh out of high school. I didn't feel like college was for me, and I didn't really want to go and turn a wrench, which seemed like about the only thing to do when I got out of high school, was to do one of those two things or the military. So I picked the third option and joined the military, and I had a recruiter talk to me about drones and, you know, said, hey, this is what you're going to be doing. You're going to be watching convoys and things like that, and I thought that sounded pretty cool. So I said, all right, let's go ahead and do it, and jumped on. When I joined the military, there wasn't a lot of info on what the job even was. It was just, hey, you're on drones and you're controlling a camera. That's really all anybody knew, especially back in 2010. What I was expecting when I joined was that I was going to be what we call Overwatch for convoys, things like that, and being able to kind of provide that eye in the sky, if you will. Didn't realize how, what we call tip of the spear, it really was. One of the first times that I realized that I was going to be actively employing weapons on this aircraft was about halfway through my training, when somebody made a comment, just I think in a break room or something like that. Looking back on it, I don't know if I was necessarily too young, but definitely wasn't set up for what the expectations were and how grueling of a job it was going to be. Because a lot of jobs are like that within the military. You know, you set 18, 19-year-olds to go out and do things, and nobody's preparing them for it. My path for training was going through basic military training at 8 weeks. Then I went to a aircrew fundamentals training past that. I think that one was 3 to 4 weeks long. I trained in New Mexico at Holloman Air Force Base for, it was about a 6-month program, what they call initial qualification training. The first time that you get hands-on with the aircraft, sitting in a ground control station, because obviously you're not physically, you know, inside the aircraft. After you complete that 6 months, you get moved on to your combat unit and go through what's called mission qualification training. It can vary in length as far as how long that goes, but it's specific to that unit, because not every unit does the same mission set. Our training was a combination of academics, simulator training, and also live flight events. Every time you were hitting a certain phase, you would go through academic training on it, you know, learn all there was to about it, the regulations, the rules, what you could do when. Then you'd go through simulator training, essentially something that mimicked the ground control station. You'd go in and you'd brief the event. You'd have 2 instructors, one for the pilot, one for the sensor, 2 students then, 1 sensor, 1 pilot, that would all get talked through really what the mission was for the day. Very similar to how a fighter pilot trains. The simulators were done because that's where you can make mistakes. That's where you can screw up. That's where you can do things that are different and dangerous and press that reset button, where the live flight, you didn't have that option. You start out with just the basics of this is what button means what. And there's a lot of them. You know, what the menus are and how to navigate them and how to utilize those buttons and menus to then get into these events and pair it with a mission. The live flights were done the exact same way. We trained on close air support, strike coordination, reconnaissance, air interdiction, combat search and rescue even. There's only a handful that I saw that actually washed out through the initial training of it. But most of the time when people washed out, it wasn't the traditional, way that you would in like SEALs training or something like that. It was more so somebody just threw a hand up and said, I can't do this anymore. They were ushered out quietly as much as possible, just because you didn't want to have it impact everybody else around you. There was definitely a learning curve on our side. The simulators were notably, and especially 15 years ago, were notably poor when it came down to the image quality, different things like that. We called them simisms. That's a simism. Like, we can't do anything about it. So you just have to wait until you get into the jet, to be able to see how it really works. So I was fresh out of the schoolhouse, got to my first combat unit, had barely been there a month. Seeing active combat missions flown for the first time, watching all the feeds every day. And I was sitting in a training event, and all of a sudden, in the middle of the training event, we got a call over the radio for that there's troops in contact. Troops in contact is when anytime any friendly forces are taking fire and they need our support, and usually needing something to do with flying or potentially operating what we call danger close. So it falls underneath the close air support mission set. So that call came over the radio. It was a JTAC on the ground. He was screaming, saying, any player, we're taking fire. Essentially we need help at that point. And so then we jumped on and responded. The pilot cued the mic, said, hey, we're only a couple miles away. We'll be there in 2 minutes. Get eyes on. At that time, I was still in being trained, so I wasn't qualified to stay in the seat and execute a strike. So the instructor that was behind me just leaned over, tapped me on the shoulder, and said, swap. Then he turned around and swapped me in, and then I stood over and watched as they were frantically trying to search for where those friendly forces are and really where the enemies were at that point, because then you're trying to figure out who's who within that, because all you see is gunfire. My first strike was January 20th, 2013, at 6:49 in the morning. Just sitting on a target, watching some top of a mud hut, nothing going on, and then all of a sudden we got a call over the radio saying, hey, we need you to move this other target area. So we started heading that way. I was pulling up graphics for it, looking at the intel, figuring out, all right, what's this location? What's the issues around it, as far as is there a bunch of trees, is there a bunch of buildings, things like that. And it ended up being a cave in the middle of nowhere. And there was a handful of people there that they wanted us to take out. We'd go through that methodical checklist. My pilot and I did things like planning for if we need another weapon immediately afterwards because some person runs or something like that. Well, then we have to be prepared to, take care of it. We in turn would get all the weapons ready, be ready for that re-attack posture, is what we called it. And then we went through and executed the strike at that point and took out a handful of people at this cave. And then we had to then immediately do a re-attack, and the person I was tasked to re-attack was sitting behind a rock. And, we turned in and we had to change the angle we were coming in from, because it was like a hallway almost with two rocks side by side. And you've got to worry about the missile coming in at a certain trajectory, being able to be effective. It's not the movies, right? It's not that, a Hellfire missile comes down and it levels the city block. It's so much smaller of an explosion. 2.5 years that I had trained up to that point, all of it came to fruition in that moment. That was the bar that was set, was can you go through and execute a strike effectively, and can you work under pressure? And when that strike came out successful, that told everyone that I could do the job and I could be called on to do it again. When we got onto that target and we were actively coming from a different target, everything was going so fast at that point. We were setting up a camera. I was calibrating my camera as we were rolling into the target area, trying to pull out the best picture I could at that point. So everything I was thinking, every thought that was going through my mind was all about the technical aspects of the employment, of shooting that weapon. There wasn't much, as far as being able to stop and think of, wow, I'm about to take a life. It was all about just the technical aspects of it all, and being able to go in and do your job. And that's all I was thinking about was, I better not screw this up. In that moment, back in 2013, I didn't have a clue what it was doing or how it was changing me or anything like that. Because all I did was just look at it as, well, I'm doing my job, and this is what I'm trained to do. I can see the entire strike start to finish in my head, on everything from that first missile impacting to the guy running to reattacking him and his lifeless body at the end of it. I've got thousands of events like that that are burned into my brain. Being physically separated, 7,500 miles away from the target, if you're watching a person for a long period of time and then, needing to take them out, it was usually what happened in the moment with it. I had one strike that we watched. I watched a person essentially get sawn in half with a missile, and his wife drag that half of him across the field. And so that one will always be burned in my brain. Can't hear anything, obviously, right? But I can still see the distraught on her face, and just, she was screaming, you could tell. And most of the time it wasn't the act of employing, it was more so like watching people literally tear each other apart. That was the stuff that stuck with me, and that was harder to deal with. One example of it is two people walking down an alleyway. One person all of a sudden reaches out, pulls a handgun out from underneath his thobe that he's wearing, and turns and just shoots the guy next to him. And the guy dropped, and then I just sat there and watched him bleed out. And then eventually the other guy just walked away, and they went, okay, follow that guy. And then you're sitting there and just actively following this person, and you have to process that you just watched somebody die. But again, you don't have time to process it. Not then. That was really the piece to it that was most difficult. There was no time that I disagreed with an order or anything like that with what I was doing. At the end of the day, I'm proud of the work I did. There were still targets at the end of the day. They were still doing bad things, and we needed to take them out. There's plenty of times that you looked at it after the facts and went, I don't really know what happened there. I mean, a lot of mission specifics, things like that, you can't talk about, right? Where we operated, who I was operating for, things like that. You just can't get into. And unfortunately, because of how much secrecy was put into it, and rightfully so, but now people feel like they can't talk about just their basic emotions. It was just strike the target, move on. Strike the target, move on. And so that's what we did, and we're very good at it. I would say I definitely wasn't emotionally prepared to deal with any of this, coming out of it, because it wasn't like, anybody openly at any time said, hey, by the way, you're going to struggle with this. I have a best friend that a couple months ago, he had a doctor that looked him in the face and said, well, you didn't deploy, so how can you have trauma? Do you have any idea how much of a kick in the face that is for somebody that's done thousands of hours, over 1,000 combat missions, and just you're gonna turn around and say that to somebody, and tell them that they can't have an issue? It's not when people are in and they're doing it that they recognize there's an issue. It's when people get out and finally pick their head up and go, oh, holy cow, I've got a lot that's impacting me because of the work I did. No one's looking at how is this affecting people when they walk out of that box, take that flight suit off, say, I'm done serving, and then go and work, whatever job they're going to. Nobody's looking at what's happening to that group of individuals, because I can promise you that's the group that's struggling the most.
Who do we have here with us today?
Up. Good boy. Up. Come on. Come on. Come on. Do it. I know you can. There you go. So, there you go. This is my service dog, Hawk, or Lord Hawthorne. And I've been with him for going on 3 years now. And he is my PTSD trained service dog. Come on, off. Good boy. Right here. Stay. He is for post-traumatic stress. So he does things like watch my back. Will put pressure on my feet in certain moments, or alert if there's someone walking towards me, anything like that I don't see. Most people, that's the big stigma out there, is everyone thinks it's a video game. That one always
cuts everybody pretty deep just because of, couldn't be farther from the truth.
You're making life or death calls every single day. You could have multiple people operating underneath one mission set. You may not have all the intel. There's a lot of things that you're trying to prepare for and a lot of preparation that goes into it. And at the end of the day, there's no reset button. There's no, hey, I'm just going to turn it off and go home. That plane's still flying when I leave that box.
The whole, gamers make great drone operators is, while there's some skills I'm sure that transfer, there's not a single game in the world that can prep you for what you're going to do and the decisions that you're going to have to make, and and the high caliber level that you're going to have to operate at. I would say some of the technical skills, right, is being able to multitask, being able to be strategic, being able to make quick decisions, right? Decision making needs to be fast, to the point, because you're pivoting so much throughout on any given mission that you just don't know what you're going to be setting yourself up for throughout the process.
Drone operations today compared to 10, 15 years ago are, I would say, different in some aspects, but underlyingly not. The missions, the things like that they're doing are still going to fall underneath the same area, but it's not going to be at such high operational costs that we did. You're not flying as insane amount of hours, but the life or death decisions you're making are still there. And you still have to go home and, see your wife and kids or your fiance or whoever at the end of the day. So the situation in Ukraine is absolutely changing everything that we look at with warfare. I mean, they've essentially made their own Air Force with small, first-person view UAS. My concerns with autonomy and AI within drone warfare would fall under if they ever take the human completely out of the loop. Letting software make life or death decisions, I think, is where we have to draw the line. And there's always going to be a human behind that, kill chain, behind that decision-making authority. The second we go away from that is, then where do you draw the line? If AI was in charge in my past missions, I mean, the impacts could have been horrible throughout it.
With the drone strike in 21 that killed a bunch of civilians, that's the thing that, is horrible, right? We hope that never happens. And at the same time, it's one of those that it's war, but you absolutely, you do everything you can to prevent it from happening again.
I think the moral injury piece of it is never going to go away.
What are some things that work for you in terms of dealing with your PTSD?
A lot of it is just, one, communicating it, and being able to talk to others about it. And I found that to be extremely therapeutic, if you will, by recognizing and allowing, people to understand that they're not alone when it comes to this, that this is a completely normal thing. I left the Air Force in September 3rd of 2018, moved to North Dakota to work for a contract company doing essentially very similar work to what I was doing in the military. I left the Air Force just because I had finished my tenure at the schoolhouse, or I was coming up on it, and the only option, being a younger staff sergeant at the time, was to go back to a combat unit and go right back into shift work and everything else. And I just knew after, I was at 8 years at that point, that my body was just tapped, and that I couldn't do that work anymore. I couldn't put myself back into, that shift work and everything else.
So I was getting paid around $38,000 a year to do that job, and with the moral injury and mental stress that went with it, it definitely wasn't nearly enough than what I should have been making. To be 19 years old and thrown into that role, and have pulled my first trigger at 20 years old, arguably it's a big reason that I got out too. Hard to keep doing that ops tempo and that type of job when you're getting paid peanuts to do it. So
I think the biggest thing that with PTSD and mental health and drone pilots especially is 10 years ago it was laughed at, that people could have it. So we're still fighting those stigmas, which is a huge problem for that community, because I think it's rampant throughout the community. Nobody wants to recognize it. And, the veterans themselves are just shells of themselves, on any given day now, and it's hard enough to put their feet on the ground. Let alone go out and do a job and, be a productive member of society. There's a lot of things that, that trauma evolves and manipulates my day-to-day, if you will. It could be things like, checking tree lines, because again, my anxiety is so high that I'm constantly, if something's moving, things like that, my brain wants to know, what is that? What's that piece of information, right? What's that sound? And then it's just trying to constantly, push out a lot of negative thoughts, negative beliefs because of the moral injury piece to this that make it just difficult to operate on a day-to-day. To be frank,
Being a drone operator,
it's taken a toll on me in my life and my family, my relationships, things like that. It's difficult for me to maintain relationships. It's difficult for me to maintain friend circles. It's difficult for me to talk to family about it, because unless somebody actually sat in that box and did the job, they don't understand. They can try to, but most of the time it ends up doing more harm than good, trying to relate to it instead of just being supportive in the moment. Remote Warrior is an organization that I started. We're building so many different things to just be able to put language to this, put common, vernacular behind all of it, and make it make sense for people that are dealing with this. We've got a guide out that's called the Fog of War Guide that we put plain language into what people may be feeling, from things like, thoughts bouncing around in your brain so fast it feels like a ping pong ball has been fired off, and that you can't focus on what you're saying. So it's being able to bring these tools and these education, materials to people, people that are struggling, but also the VA, Guard and Reserve units, academia. I mean, you name it. We have training plans, lesson plans for all of it to bring in, discussions on identity crisis, moral injury, all these pieces that come into play, and that, these, industry professionals need to understand and need to start taking the human into account, and not just the person on paper.
Hi, I'm a producer on Authorized Account. If you like this episode, then you should check out our new podcast and comment below with the names of people you'd love to hear us interview.
This is a big nap time, huh?